Good evening. Thank you for joining Women at the Edge, Economics and Beyond. Women at the Edge is a series of events focusing on women in rural and regional Victoria and our sisters across the state and nation. The series is being presented in partnership with the Wheeler Centre and Women's Health Goulburn North East. My name's Amanda Kelly and I'm the CEO of Women's Health Goulburn North East. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Bangarang people of the Yorta Yorta Nation, and I would like to open this event by acknowledging the wisdom, living culture and connection to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I also want to acknowledge the profound disruption of colonisation and the stolen generations on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Women's Health Goulburn North East supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the constitutional and legislative changes that form the two key elements of the statement. We also support the establishment of the Makarrata Commission. And I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the proud women of our First Nations, as well as all the other generations of great women whose work has brought us closer to equality for all. Women's Health Goulburn North East is one of 9 specialist regional women's health services across Victoria. We apply a gendered lens to the factors and environments that shape women's health and wellbeing in the Goulburn and Ovens-Murray regions in Victoria. Our expertise is in women's economic empowerment, gender and climate change, gender equity, sexual and reproductive health, and the prevention of violence against women. We started working with the Wheeler Centre on developing our series of Women at the Edge talks, events in July 2019. And I want to thank Hiroki Kobayashi and his team at the Wheeler Centre, who have been a complete dream to work with. As many of you know, the Wheeler Centre quickly became an integral part of the cultural landscape of Melbourne when it was launched over 10 years ago, and we're very excited to work with them as part of their regional and rural program. The first event in our series was held in March 2020, just in that sweet spot between the catastrophic bushfires and the global pandemic. So there were over 100 people who met in person in Beechworth in Victoria to talk about women and history. Since then, Women's Health has focused on observing and understanding the implications of these truly awful events for our communities, thinking about the impacts for now and in the future. We extended an invitation to the Victorian Minister for Women, the Honourable Gabrielle Williams, to be here this evening, but due to prior commitments, which I think we can all understand given what's happening in the last couple of days, she was unable to make it. But she has, however, prepared a short video for us to play in her absence. So I'd now like to introduce the Minister for Women, Gabrielle Williams.
Thank you for organising this event in support of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Thanks for being part of a global commitment to address gender inequality and eradicate violence against women and girls. It's more important than ever that we do everything we can to prevent gendered violence. Research shows us that COVID-19 has created an international crisis for women's safety. And here in Australia, this came on top of immense pressures caused by the recent and devastating bushfires. 1 in 10 Australian women are reporting that they have experienced family violence during the pandemic, 1/3 of those for the first time. We know that the pandemic has intensified the underlying drivers of violence against women, which of course includes economic security and access to paid work. That's why during the 16 days, the Victorian Government is again focusing on our Respect Women Call It Out campaign. We're asking people to consider what respect means, what it looks like, and how to put it into practice in their everyday lives. I want to thank you all for the amazing work you do to connect and build respect within your communities. With today's event, you acknowledge the amazing resilience of women in regional areas. This is vitally important work, and I look forward to hearing more.
So I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Minister for her support of our work on an ongoing basis and, of course, of this event in particular. Thank you, Minister. So As the Minister says, we've just commenced the 16 days of activism to prevent violence against women. The campaign was launched in 1991 for the Centre for Women's Global Leadership, and almost 3 decades on, 16 Days, as it's called, is a widely recognised global campaign and organising strategy for individuals and groups to call for the elimination of all forms of gender-based violence. For so many reasons, we think the time is right for a shift in focus from awareness of this issue, which this campaign is fantastic at doing, from awareness to accountability. The fallout from COVID-19 has intensified rates of violence against women in communities across Australia, at the same time as increasing women's unpaid care and domestic workloads and putting at risk women's livelihood and economic security. So as we begin to think about recovery, the shift in awareness as a result of the bushfires and the pandemic presents an opportunity to actually transform our current economic model and its cultural and social underpinnings into one that has women's human rights and gender equality at its core. And this is what this evening's panel conversation is all about. It's a real pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening. So in no particular order, because they are all pretty amazing women, I first of all would like to introduce Leanne Miller. Leanne is a descendant of the Doolan-Yaggan Ulupna clan, Yorta Yorta Nation. She is the Executive Director of Koori Women Mean Business. She is a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social Equity at Melbourne University and an inaugural member of the First People's Assembly of Victoria, representing the North East region. Leanne's provided leadership support to governments and corporates on Indigenous workforce development and community engagement. She has an extensive advocacy background working in Indigenous, legal and women's sectors and has represented Australian Indigenous women at the United Nations New York, as well as undertaking UN fellowships in New York and Geneva. She was selected as the Community Representative, Australian Government Delegation to the 54th session on the Commission on the Status of Women, United Nations, New York. She's also delightful, and I can't wait for her to, for you to hear her speaking tonight. Angela Jackson. Angela started her career as an economist at Australia's Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and has worked across tax, fiscal and social policy. As the then Finance Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff, Angela worked on the government's response to the GFC and major reforms across health, education and disability sectors. As lead economist at Equity Economics, Angela has authored a number of major reports, including Supporting Economic Recovery in New South Wales, Investment in Social and Affordable Housing is Critical to Supporting Jobs Today and Families into the Future, and Gender-Based Impacts of COVID-19. Appearing regularly in the media, Angela has written For the Conversation, The Age and The Australian, and I'm very much looking forward to working more with Angela as well on the Gender Equity Victoria board. Dr. Rowan O'Hagan Rowan is an agricultural scientist and regional economist with extensive research, consulting and governance experience across health, utilities and higher education and agriculture. She holds a PhD in regional economics and her research and consulting interests include capacity building in primary industries, climate adaptation and governance. She is currently Research Development and Governance Officer at North East Health Wangaratta. Rowan's a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, Deputy Chair of community energy retailer Indigo Power and a Director of Albury Wodonga Health. Rowan's lived regionally most of her life and is dedicated to equity and prosperity for regional Australians. She's active in the rural women's participatory democracy and sustainability movements, being a founding member of Australian Women in Agriculture, the Wangaratta Sustainability Network, the Northeast Regional Sustainability Alliance, and Voices for Indi. And she's also extremely welcoming when you move into a new community, not knowing many people. So it's lovely to have you here, Rowan. And finally, we have our moderator for this evening, Gabrielle Chan. So Gabrielle's been a journalist for more than 30 years. She began covering politics in the 1990s for The Australian at the New South Wales Parliament and in the Canberra Press Gallery. She's worked for Guardian Australia since 2013 in roles including political correspondent and politics life blogger. The city-born daughter of a Singaporean migrant, Gabrielle moved to a sheep and wheat farm in 1996, where she noticed the yawning gap between Parliament and small-town life. The result is Rusted Off, Why Country Australia is Fed Up, which was shortlisted for the 2019 Prime Minister's Literary Awards and the 2020 Walkley Book Prize. Gabrielle is currently working on her next book on food, farming and landscape. And having dived into Rusted Off and finding it really enlightening, I'm really looking forward to the next book, Gabrielle. Thank you. So I am going to get off your screen and I'm going to hand over to our amazing panel of women. So please be welcome to Women at the Edge, Economics and Beyond.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks very much for that lovely introduction and welcome to all the panellists. I mean, I think the great thing about our panellists tonight is that they have both that kind of state national view combined with a connection into local community. And I think that's really important to balance those two things so that we get a more holistic view. Now, before I start, if anyone wants to ask questions, we welcome them, and you can do so by typing them into the YouTube's comment section. You will need to log into a Google account. Otherwise, you can get on Twitter and tag @Wheeler Centre and send us your questions that way. So I want to start with some personal observations from our panellists, because I think everyone has experienced this kind of weird year differently, slightly differently. A lot of the themes will be the same and a lot of the themes we'll dig into throughout the conversation. But I'll start with Leanne. How has the pandemic been for you and the women around you? What have you noticed? What's stood out in this period?
For me, it's definitely about resilience. A lot of my friends have pivoted clearly, done some stretches in connecting into Zooms and Teams, juggling their children's schooling. I have nothing but admiration for that. But I think one of the things that people have learned has been around social interaction and how we connect as a community and as women. And I find that women are the best networkers. So there's been an absence of friends, but online is not the same for me. Yeah, I think there are going to be a number of mental health issues that'll play out over the next 5 to 10 years. And I worry a wee bit about the students and how they've been impacted by a lot of what's been going on and how disruptive it's been.
And personally, has it changed your life, the way you go about what you do around your community?
It's a bit early to tell. But I have probably been home twice, and I still feel that it's still really early, and I come from a large family. I'm a 1 in 10. So interaction will take some time, and it's a slow build for us until Christmas because of young kids, older parents in their 90s and 80s. So we believe it will take some time, just even in Zoom calls and conversations. I feel that social distance was so heavily emphasised that half of the ones in my family feel that we should still social distance, and the younger ones just can't get enough hugs and cuddles and conversations in. So I feel it's the same in a lot of different scenarios. So it depends on the context. Like, we were heavily involved in each other's lives, and this has kind of been a very interesting piece over the last 6 months in Victoria. So we feel that we're not alone. But yeah, it will impact, I think. But I'm always looking forward to going home and coming back and being amongst everyone down by the river. So yeah, pretty simple.
Thank you. Angela, how have you found it?
Challenging, I think would be the word. So I do have young kids, so it's been, homeschooling and managing all that. Fortunate, I have work, and, most of my cohort has not lost their jobs. So I think that appreciation that, materially this hasn't impacted us that much, and most of us probably have, reasonable housing, so, we can spread out along the house. And so really it hasn't been that bad, that we're in a fortunate position. But it has been challenging. It's really, I think, tested relationships. It's tested, I think, resilience, and that isolation. I'm from Tasmania, so a sort of, I guess, a regional space, and not being able to see family or friends and be disconnected across space, or to go back there to a place where I feel very connected, has been really tough. Just to be told that's not possible, and when would it be possible? It's been a really difficult year, I think. But learnt a lot. And I think, coming out, you can see that things have changed, maybe for the better, and learnt a lot about what was working and wasn't working in our lives. So, I would never do it again, but trying to find the positives going forward.
I've noticed a lot of people in conversation have been thinking about people who are worse off than them. So everyone's been much more careful to think about, well, it's been frustrating, it's been emotional, it's been really hard, but I'm sure there's people who are doing it tougher. I seem to hear that a lot. Rowan, how's your experience been? Because you work in a health service, even though you don't see clients face to face in terms of direct service delivery. What have you discovered?
Well, for my family, we have been fortunate. We haven't seen a huge amount of impact or disruption on our family, but certainly for other families, there's a huge anxiety. There's been a lot of movement with adult children coming home, and which is nice to see them, but it's also very disruptive to their lives. And of course, as Angela mentioned, people who are younger children are busy with homeschooling, and other people who have actually provided refuge for backpackers, and other people who were unable to return home or had nowhere to go, basically through the pandemic. So some people have been living in very busy houses, and others have been very isolated and very alone. And of course, that so everyone's circumstances is different. In terms of those who have been employed, and particularly employed in the health sector, well, the demands have been incredible. The uncertainty of coming into work each day and not being sure what you're going to be facing, and also what you're going to be asked to do in terms of pivoting and multitasking, lots of different roles and things. So I think that constant uncertainty has really exhausted people. Looking forward, we hope, to sort of more normal summer, COVID normal summer, whatever that means. But one good thing is that we've had a good season locally, seasonal conditions for agriculture, so that even though drought conditions do persist in some areas, it's been a real bonus for us, I think, in this region.
Okay, so I want to go on to maybe some more concrete experiences. Angela, do you want to just lay out what we know so far in terms of the data, in terms of the effect of, the pandemic on the employment market, particularly for women, and how those figures pan out?
So we know that the nature of the pandemic, and from an economist point of view, it's a very unusual shock, so normally it's a demand side shock. This was a supply side shock, and things were just shut down. And the industries that had to be shut down from a health perspective were primarily female dominated. So it meant a lot of females lost their jobs. Females are also more likely to be in casual work, and so a lot of those jobs were the first to go, so they weren't in secure employment. So we're still looking, though, at around 60% of the jobs that have been lost across the economy across Australia are female jobs. And so it has impacted women and women's participation in the workforce more than men. In Victoria, it's even worse. And there's a few reasons for that, namely the reopening of the economy sort of favoured male-dominated industries like construction ahead of more female-dominated industries. And so as of October, over 80% of the jobs lost across the economy were female jobs. So that's just a huge economic impact on women, and in terms of their empowerment, across also within relationships. So I think that link then to domestic violence is a really important one. We know that when women lose economic empowerment, their probability or their chances of being victims of domestic violence go up. So it's had a massive impact on women. On top of that, obviously the caring responsibilities have been huge, and we can think about that as both formal and informal. As someone who was doing homeschooling, I managed to negotiate with my husband, so we equally shared that role, which was a huge change for us in our relationship, which was great. But for a lot of women, they've carried the predominant of that, that burden. The male has just gone into the study and closed the door, and they've been left with the kids all day while trying to juggle work. And then in the healthcare sector, already we've discussed, women are at the front line of this pandemic in aged care and in nursing, and in terms of being, open to getting COVID and having to manage that shift work along with kids. And I've got some friends who are nurses. It's a huge burden. They're risking every day going to work, whether they get COVID. They've also got kids who are in ISO school and then homeschooling. It's been an incredibly difficult year, I think, for women across the board. And economically, the impacts might be far-reaching, and that's why it's important policies like in yesterday's budget in Victoria, which get women back to work, are so critical, that we get those gains back as quickly as possible. Because we know the longer you're out of work, the longer you're likely to be out of work, and the worse the long-term outcomes.
I just want to underline that more than 80% of the jobs lost in the last month have been women's jobs.
In Victoria, in 80%
in Victoria.
of the jobs since the start of the pandemic, so since February, 80% of the job losses. And then in October, what we saw was a really worrying trend, I think, which was in full-time employment, which is, part-time employment's important and it's really good for women because it gives women that flexibility to work. But obviously full-time jobs are kind of, where it's at in some ways from an economic perspective. 100,000 extra male full-time jobs across Australia, whereas full-time female employment went back 3,000. So there's this real disparity opening up in the economic recovery that I think we have to keep an eye on because, women have made gains. They're very slow in Australia, way slower than we would like over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, but there have been gains in our economic achievement and participation. We don't want to lose, 10, 15 years of gains due to this pandemic.
Is that possible?
I think it is. I think there is a danger there that, especially young women, that time out of the workforce, and that time in the workforce when they're young, it is critical for young women because they have a limited time. If you think about a woman's, labour force participation, she sort of has 10 years or so at the start of her career before she has children. It's really critical that skill development. And then she'll probably go into a period of part-time employment, and then come out the other side and maybe back to full-time. So that young period, that period for especially young women who've lost their jobs in retail and hospitality, it is critical we get them back to work as soon as possible.
Leanne, aged care. I know you deal with some Indigenous specific aged care and housing.
Oh.
How has that been going? The way the pandemic's played out.
When I reflect on the beginning of the pandemic, my community, Aboriginal community controlled health organisations, have stood up and informed community from the outset that there was something that was coming, and started to kind of relay this to a number of different ways at their health facilities. My parents are in Rumbalara Aboriginal Elders Facility, and they've been in lockdown since the 18th of March. So there are still people in lockdown. And there's 2 aged care facilities across the state that are community owned and operated. Same regulations, same standards, such a mixture of diverse staff, and all have not had, touch wood, the effects or the pre-effects come through the facility. They all, when I say all the residents could be 20 to 40, small catchment, but very high risk in terms of their health needs and their chronic illnesses. They have doctors that do come in through the arrangements with the managers and the health facilities, and a lot of them are still in lockdown. And we are sitting here saying, oh, we're so glad and we're out of lockdown. We get an hour a day with them, and that isn't outside the premises, it's within the confines. And I understand the most vulnerable groups in Australia, but they're also the ones that people don't talk about or recognise. And when it comes to the recent announcement in budget, I see that there's some really challenging areas that have been picked up for further funding. One of those I see is housing, and in terms of rural and regional settings, it couldn't happen any sooner. There's very minimal ways of moving and finding accommodation, and a lot of people have tended to forget about what's happened to these people during the pandemic and where have they gone, and who's picked them up. Because it hasn't been just in Melbourne. I mean, there's been growing numbers in regional locations, Bendigo, Ballarat, Shepparton. There are people still sleeping on the riverbanks that have slept through winter in that particular instance that we've just come through. And I find that challenging, and I find that when people talk about housing and pathways to housing, our processes are extremely limited. We have family, we have friends, we have organisations that have housing, but the occupancy, it's always over occupied because we operate on an extended kinship family system. So I feel that housing, to me, when they talked about what was happening in the Commission flats in North Melbourne, was overwhelming. And yet there was no discussion about what was happening with the homelessness in the streets of Melbourne or the streets in regional centres. I thought there was a bit of unbalance in information. But I have lots of ways in which I feel that housing is useful to fund, but I also think that there has to be a holistic approach to delivering of services and a consistent one. I think the
Yeah.
pandemic
I mean,
has actually pulled out a lot of the loose areas that a lot of NGOs have talked about and lobbied about. It's become more and more unstuck in reality because of the pandemic. So we didn't have it as bad as overseas, but what we did see are the cracks of our society and the band-aid approaches that aren't working, that should be working in some instances. And it's been a bit exacerbated by people not being able to go out, people being told that they have to wear masks. We completely stayed home, did the full mask and minimum contacts and exercise, but we were also looking to see what was happening on the street. It was a bit of a scattered approach around that. And
Right.
I felt that, what is community safety anymore? Do people understand what community safety is?
Yeah, I mean, how do you keep eyes on people who might be moved out of a condition where you talked about a lot of people have moved out?
Yeah.
Is there a way of tracking those people down to ensure they don't fall between the cracks?
I think that there are planned approaches to reconnect with people, but there isn't a concerted effort or an approach. And it's a bit like anything that you run as a project. It's personality driven. So the person that's there that has eyes on the prize, a great reach, will actually bring them in and bring them into the conversations.
Right. Rowan, what are you seeing in terms of the regional economy, particularly in relation to regional housing? There's been reports that rents have increased, for example, which makes it harder for people to either stay in housing or get into new housing. Health services, I'm not sure if health services have been really stretched in some of the regional economies. I know in our local town, which is about 2,500, there was a real kind of preparation in case that there was an influx, but it didn't happen in our particular region. What's happening structurally in the areas that you keep an eye on as a regional economist?
Well, particularly for the housing market, there's been an increase in house prices and an increase in demand, which anecdotally is coming from people wanting to move from metropolitan areas. Of course, that puts a strain on the local supply of housing and pushing up the prices, which is good for those who are in the market, but it also does have an impact on people wanting to get into the rental market. So rental affordability, as you mentioned, is becoming less affordable, basically. So it really remains to be seen how that will play out in the longer term, and whether or not it'll lead to increased construction in regional areas as well, or whether it'll just be a sort of a short wave that might pass fairly quickly. In terms of the health services, other than the yes, they did gear up for an expectation of COVID patients, which fortunately we didn't have. Most of the local health services didn't actually see. But mental health services are under a huge amount of pressure. We talked about the impact of unemployment, particularly on younger women and women of working age, and they are also the cohort that are most at risk of poor mental health. So, there's this nexus between employment and mental health. But at the same time, where we hadn't even begun to address the trauma and the issues from the bushfires before we launched into COVID, and the difficulty of delivering mental health services face-to-face, one-on-one with clients. And so a lot of that has shifted to telehealth, which raises and increases the accessibility to a large extent, but it also has its own issues in terms of the quality of access and therapy that people can access.
Do you have a view on how long the tail will be on mental health issues coming out of this year with bushfires and COVID?
Look, sadly, I think a lot of it is going to be fairly permanent, but funds have been coming in, so there has been a response from government and health services in relation to delivery of services and the models of delivery as well. But really, it's going to be an ongoing issue, I believe.
Federal and state budgets, of course, was the opportunity to really make a first response to COVID and this year's lockdown. Angela, what did you see out of the budget? Were you a bit disappointed at the lack of women's specific programs with rises in funding for things like construction jobs, trade jobs, not traditional women's industries? So what did you make of the federal budget, and was the state budget much better?
It's a really relatively easy question. Look, I was, to be honest, livid, and I don't get livid that often. I try to say quite even keel, but when I saw what was in the budget for women, the federal budget this is, it was disbelief, to be honest with you, that they'd spent more, I think, on recycling than they had on women's economic security, and disappointment, because I thought the case had really been made and was pretty clear that to power the recovery, women had to be doing well. So it's not even, I know we see this as a gender issue and people often say, oh, why are you so sexist? Why do you just care about women? Well, number one, because we're 50% of the population. And if women aren't doing well, the economy is not doing well. And the same can be said for all groups of the society, right? So if people in the low socioeconomic groups aren't doing as well as they could do, the whole economy is not doing as well as they could do. So to see it through the prism of what we're really about here is ensuring that everybody in Australia has the opportunity and is doing as well as they can is actually good for all of us, and that we're all in it together. And that was just really missing, and none of the real lessons of I think the pandemic came through. And I think going back to the housing question, I've never seen anything as clear. I'm a health economist, about the social determinants of health all the time, and we talk about housing as being one of the key ones. Well, in Victoria, how obvious and clear was it that, as a social determinant, housing, had a huge role to play in the pandemic. It's why we had to go into a second lockdown effectively, because of the overcrowding in social housing in this state. But that affects people in that situation day in, day out. It was just at this time it affected all of us, and so we had to take notice. And thus you've seen, I think, this huge investment in social housing, which maybe they would have done anyway, but I think there is a real understanding in the community now that, you cannot disconnect this situation with people's outcomes, and that it is a direct link. And I think people can see that for the first time. So in Victoria, we saw a very different response. We saw them talking about the gender impacts of the budget of the pandemic. We saw them acknowledging it, and even with, they had the roadmap to reopening, which heavily favoured male jobs, and I criticised them for that. It was all about construction opening up first, but they'd done the analysis to know that that's what they were doing, and then have put in place, I guess, mitigating policies to help women get back to work now that the economy has opened up. So at least there was an acknowledgement there, and they've addressed the problem. So yes, Victoria has done a lot better. New South Wales has also done a lot better. There's been a real acknowledgement there. There's been programs around getting women back into work, programs around kinder as well in New South Wales. So I think the state governments have done a lot better, but the federal government really did, I think, let women down. This idea of we drive on roads is just ridiculous. We need jobs, and we have a right, our work and our jobs are just as important as male jobs. And I think that's the other thing I've heard, that because we're not the breadwinners, we're not as important. And, you know, that is changing and it's going to continue to change. But I think, you know, economically, what we do is incredibly important. And we know that the caring roles that we undertake, and the professional jobs and all the jobs, you know, women are very important to the economy, and we need to be, you know, looked after and taken seriously. And our economic futures, if they're not looked after, well, then the country will suffer. And I think that's what the government missed.
Leanne, why do you think that a lot of these programs, women-specific programs, are considered a burden rather than a way of stimulating extra economic activity, of adding extra to the nation and our local communities? It's sort of seen to be as, you know, a gift, you know, a bucket that you put aside to keep women, you know, tick that box, keep them happy.
Yeah, I tend to
Or am I being ungenerous?
think that I tend to think that, you know, there's been a number of different spotlights around women and women's programs. I think, you know, the big question out of all of this for me, and just listening to Angela, was, oh my gosh, so how long will it take for this gender pay gap to start moving? I'm like, this has set us back so much. And I am, for one, a bit struck by how much this has set back women's pay gap and the campaigns that we've been running for the last 2 years. And, you know, people are saying that, you know, we've all got to reset and rethink. I would think that this would be part of the mix. Would it be?
Yeah, well, yes. Well, you would think so. Rowan, are the programs that we're seeing coming out, as small as they may be, some of them, is that really just catch up? I mean, or can we get ahead of this? Is there a way of getting ahead of this? A way of making governments thinking about getting ahead rather than always, you know, catching up on an absence that has been there in government programs?
Oh, I think there's definitely opportunities where the investment, as you say, you know, that we talk about it as a cost, as a bucket of money that they're just going to keep handing out, but it's actually an investment in the future. And as Angela points out, 50% of the population, when we're talking about women, so that, you know, the federal budget really missed the mark in terms of that investment for the future, particularly for regional areas. So, you know, no support basically for renewable energy, which is going to be a huge economic boost in industry for regional areas, which will benefit everybody. You know, higher education, which is a huge economic driver in regional areas, services sector, aged care, which we've already spoken about, and rural childcare was, you know, it's basically been decimated, mobile childcare services in regional areas. So it was good actually then to see the state budget a little bit more positive, really, for both some of these short-term but also longer-term investments. Again, the social housing, which we've mentioned, employment, some education initiatives, and also a big investment into renewables. So there can be short-term boosts for employment, but there also, you know, there's a longer-term investment in where we actually want to go as an economy and as a society and community. The one thing that is pretty close to my heart in our region, the level of digital literacy is very low. And of course, we've seen very clearly through the pandemic that digital divide just was incredible, and how important it was that people were connected. And so the initiatives, state government, Victorian government initiatives around digital literacy in regional areas, I think is really going to be important, but of course it would also be nice to have that backed up by more reliable broadband services that we could all use as well.
Yeah, that was a factor in homeschooling as well, wasn't it? I remember seeing lots of reports about that. So in the absence of government support, what are I want to talk now about the positives that we've seen. Pardon me. Leanne, you saw some pretty interesting things, and it turns out Koori women do mean business, right? Tell us about some of the amazing strides that were made in Indigenous businesses run by women.
Sure. At KWMV, we had a focus on cottage women, women in cottage industries, and during the pandemic, we saw a growing number of mothers getting online and just showing their artwork. And one that comes to mind is Yali Creative. She had her second baby. She started putting up images saying, "This is my artwork, this is my artwork." And then she started to sell, and the business has started to take off during the pandemic. And she went through T-shirts, used her family as, the pin-up people for her garments. And now she has a thriving Facebook and website, Mummypreneur. And she's made great strides in terms of Instagram, but her artwork has also been part of a play on women's organisation and donating a percentage back, a bit of social responsibility for her. And then there's a boom in traditional healing and workshops that has started to come through in the last 4 months. And there seems to be a growing movement with young mothers who are looking at ethical, traditional ingredients in their product, and one that is in regional Victoria. They're all in Victoria, is Glowing Aura. And then we have one that a grandmother has started, and it seemed to have taken off with her balms and her meditation on country, and her name is Petter, and the company is Wanyan. So we've seen quite a lot of cottage industry like backroom sewing. They've started to come out and start saying, we can mend this and we can do it for free, or we can do it at a discount. And that's something that I would have never seen happen before. How they've just turned it around into a small business with a little bit of incentive from federal government Department of Business. But they seem to be thriving on the social media aspects of, having conversations and spreading their jewellery and artworks.
So is there somewhere that people can go and see, is there a portal or a hub on your website where people can connect into those businesses?
We are preparing a hub, and we've started running small business series, getting ready for 2021, called Exhale for Small Business. But apart from that, there's also some existing hubs around women in business. I know that within Victoria, there's a number that have put their hand up to be a part of the Kinaway Chamber of Commerce, who have a small business directory as well.
Right. Rowan, you're into democratic capital. Are people engaging more in the political process, or even their local community networks? Is that how do you describe democratic capital and social capital in terms of the way women connect and get things done at a community level, maybe separate from government or adjacent to government?
Well, you mentioned that, what happens without government support, but I think we should never really underestimate how important it is to have the policy levers and the legislative framework that actually does enable our economy to work better for everybody. And the only way we're going to be able to drive that agenda is better representation. The way we get better representation is to really build and exercise our democratic capital, which is really, it's about how we use our democracy and our processes of election and representation to get the best representation that we can and ensure that the policies and the funding then starts to flow. So if we don't engage in that process, and it could be at local government, we've just had local government elections here in Victoria with a record number of women elected to councils, which is fantastic. But also, at the federal level, we've seen some issues around how it's not always a convivial place to be for women, but we need to really be exercising our democratic muscle and making change in that area. You can see I'm quite passionate about this particular.
Yeah. Have women got a bigger role to play in that, maybe, in those less traditional processes? Is that what you're seeing, or is that overstating it?
I'd like to see them engaged in the structures that are there at the moment, but also use those structures or drive change within those structures in our democracy to ensure that they are well represented, because it is quite clear that things are different when there are more women decision makers and more women at the table.
Angela, what are you seeing in terms of positivity out of this? You mentioned right at the beginning, that kind of renegotiation that happens within households and within communities about, okay, we've got all these extra responsibilities now. How are we going to divide these responsibilities? Is that the key thing that you're seeing change, that negotiation?
Look, I think so, because I think for me, the household really is the key point. I mean, I think in democracy, yes, there's a key role for women to have a greater role, and that's one big part of it. And that's, something that we all need to probably do our bit towards in terms of supporting more women and probably putting ourselves forward more as well for positions. But it really is in that household dynamic where women carry so much more of that burden. And it's such an important part, like, to remember the household is about 50% of the economic activity. We just don't count it in the economy, right? So what happens within the household is actually critical. And what this pandemic showed was how critical it is. And I think for women in lockdown, suddenly it became very clear that, oh, well, if I'm caring, I can't work. And I know that seems like a really basic concept, like it seems like when you say it, but just really living it and understanding that, well, actually, whoever is caring can't work. And, I've now got not a baby, which is where most women take on that caring role for the first time, which I have to breastfeed and care for. It's now an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old. So actually, you could do this, or I could do it. And who does it then determines who works. And it's really, I think, changed the thinking about how we think about caring within the household. And so that renegotiation where we got into those patterns of behaviour, because that's what often happens, economics, it becomes quite dynamic. So whoever starts out caring in the first period is more likely to care in the second period, etc. It interrupted that dynamics, and there has been, I think, a lot of renegotiation. Not everyone has come out on top in that renegotiation. I don't think, in some cases households haven't changed that much, but for a lot it has evened up significantly, and men are now carrying more of that mental load. They carried more of the homeschooling load. It was a more equal distribution. And that means women are free to work, right? And they're free to do the other things they want to do in their lives, and participate in other ways in public life. So I think in that sense, like as a social experiment of sort of something that really went to I would say, a cognitive dissonance that occurs where women believe that they're the better carers when actually, we found in our household, my husband was way more patient and better at homeschooling than I was. We shared it equally, but he was far more successful. is that we tend to, you know, our views and our opinions tend to follow our actions. And I think that's what happens a lot in households. And so we get stuck in these relationships and in these roles that might not necessarily accord with where our natural abilities lie. And I think what the pandemic has done is shaken that all up a bit. And that will, I think, help women going forward. So I think that's something to be positive about. It is a period of adjustment. But I think if, you know, in next year and the year after, women are carrying less of that load, then they have more time to do other things, and participate in society and participate at work more, and that will advance women a lot, and this generation of women a lot going forward. That's my hope, and maybe we have to wait for the statistics to be borne out. But I think, you know, I think the potential is there, that it's been quite positive for a lot of women.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see whether with everyone in the home and everyone seeing what's going on, and seeing the load for the primary carer, whether it seeps into government policy as well. You know, if suddenly say the minister is at home watching the kids, or you know, the CEO is at home having to wrangle, you know, in the process of writing my current draft, I did lots of Zoom meetings with people who were kind of hiding in their offices saying, no, not now, not now. Come, you know, change. Like it's got to change things, right, in some respects. But I do wonder whether there will be, whether that change will be uneven over various demographic groups. Do you think that will be a factor?
Look, almost certainly, and I think that's one thing. You know, I'm talking from, you know, the position, again, you know, employed, university educated white woman. So, you know, my lens through this is, you know, incredibly privileged as it comes. That said, I think, you know, across socioeconomic groups, we will have seen this change. And we've also seen, I think, in some households where women have become the primary earner because they probably have kept their job, whereas the male has lost their job. So I think the dynamics can change across the board. And, you know, the extent to which that occurs, it's definitely, you know, a good thing. And, you know, social change is something that needs to happen across the board, and we need to keep, I think, that, you know, very conscious of that. And with the lenses we put on things, you know, we're arguing a lot for this gender lens, but really having that socioeconomic lens and having a lens in terms of how are things affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, how things affecting different racial groups, different ethnic backgrounds, it's also critically important, because, you know, we need to understand how policies affect everybody, and that the fact that they do affect everyone differently it's really important, and we don't do anywhere near enough of that in Australia.
Leanne or Rowan, do you want to comment on that, how that negotiation happens within the household, whether you think there will be change around that? Leanne, do you want to start?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
We have a higher ratio of female household number ones, and it tends to have been women who have gone out, held the job the longest. Men have been seasonal workers, or they've, you know, suffered during the pandemic like others, being laid off the job. But our women have maintained the roles in terms of their employment. Their number one employment is with Aboriginal community controlled health organisations. The second employer is the public service. So they sit well. But the generalist population is we believe that it will play out, given the recent announcements with budget. The opportunities and the flourishing of opportunities will come to the younger generation rather than, you know, the 50 plus or the 45 plus, because that's where most have put a lot of the planning and unpacked a lot of their scaffolding and career guidance around. Not to say that the age range outside of that will not have opportunities. Theirs would be more around grounded approaches to lead younger people through the workforce. And there's always been limited opportunities in regional and rural settings, but there seems to be a boom in relation to small business and business growth. So we shall see.
And you're also seeing people coming back to country from city areas too.
Yeah,
Is that right?
that's interesting. Yes, we are. And I think it's all around reconnection with country, and a reconnection around what they can bring back to their community and what they have learnt and what they can share. And there's also an interest in staying firmly back on country rather than just a temporary holiday shack. There sure is a number of conversations that have been happening around, you know, the different ways in which the people who are on country are thinking of rebuilding their homes. But also there's a growing number that have said, no, we've had enough. We can do our job and perform our role back on country, and the fit and the feel is just right.
Which means a much more cohesive community, you would think, in particular areas.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's going to be exciting to see what happens in the next 6 months in relation to that move, because as you know, people tend to kind of move back and forwards and not settle, but there seems to be a big beeline to go home to country.
Rowan, do you want to talk about that renegotiation, both at the domestic level and maybe the state level? Do you think that we will see change? There's a lot of essays and books and thinking coming out now around, you know, how can we use this historic moment to kind of rewrite things? And everyone's got a wish list. And it seems to me how government, state, federal, local choose their priorities is going to be a really big question, right? Because everyone wants to use it as a springboard to more positive change. How do you see it going forward?
Well, I am hopeful that there will be a cultural shift. I think it has highlighted those aspects of who cares for the kids, and also who teaches our kids. I'm sure there's a heightened appreciation of teachers and the roles of schools, and a much more awareness, I think, from men that they can work from home, that there can be much more flexibility around. You know, it's not just you go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and you come back at 7 o'clock at night. There is actually some productivity, and there's something to be gained from just having a lot more flexibility. But of course, we still need the childcare to back it up. So initiatives around childcare and early childhood education are also going to need to be resourced for that to happen. There are other areas where, you know, there's opportunities for shifts, and it is around the appreciation of you know, certain sectors and services that we all need, that we didn't necessarily appreciate in the past. Agriculture is one of them. We didn't realise that, in fact, you know, that we need our agricultural industries to be functioning, and we need those food supply to be reliable, along with some other grocery items that I won't mention. But yeah, so I just really feel that there is an opportunity, and it's partly a mindset for women to be aware, but of course much more an opportunity for men to think about. So, you know, this is actually what happens in my house during the day while I'm not there, and perhaps I should be participating in it a bit more.
Angela, do you have a couple of priorities for anyone from governments listening about what could change things for women going forward?
I think for me, it does start, well, I mean, the things around education, health, there's a huge gambit, obviously, but I think for a lot of women, that inequality in the relationship starts with the birth of a child, and that really comes down to parental leave and who we skill up and who we subsidise to skill up in the caring roles. And at the moment, what we effectively do as a society is that we anoint the woman and we give her all the support and she gets all the skills and it feels fantastic. And then suddenly you are literally left holding a baby and the husband has no skills and he can't do it. And so you end up doing it. So I think if we really want women to be equal to men and individuals to make decisions based on their own preferences and their own actual innate skills rather than this social pressure to necessarily care, then we need to support men to stay at home and gain those skills and to see caring, I think, as a skill and a really important one, right? So caring for children is probably the most important thing any of us as individuals ever do, is raise our children, and to see that for the value it is, but to also say that men could do it too and women could do it too, and we could as a society have a more equal approach, and so everyone's talents get used rather than just one gender is in this role and one gender's in that role. So that's what I would like. That's where I would start right at the beginning.
Okay. Leanne, do you have a couple of priorities that you would point governments to in terms of women's position and freeing up opportunities more?
I think the opportunity to travel regional centres and listen to women are extremely important. And also the investment of women's mental health in those areas. Sometimes a 1-800 number is just not good enough. Sometimes, the possibilities aren't unlocked until conversations are had, and I think they need to do some listening tours.
That's a great idea. Yeah, that face-to-face, nothing can replace it, can it?
Nothing in 1,001 Zooms could replace it.
I think we're all over Zoom now.
I am.
I do. Yeah, I do remember, the early days. Remember when we all committed, well, we're all going to have drinks together on Zoom, and it got sort of tired very quickly, didn't it? Anyway, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. So before I hand over to Amanda, I think everyone watching will agree that it's been a fantastic conversation. And I've actually personally learned a hell of a lot, both on the hurdles and the creativity of women in rural and regional areas in this kind of crazy 2020 that we're all living through. So here's Amanda. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Yeah, I'm on. Great, thank you. So look, thank you all so much. I was riveted, and I was wanting to take notes to summarise what was discussed, and I just found myself like I just can't write notes because I'm too engrossed in what's going on. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your time this evening and for being here to have this really important discussion. And I think if I were going to summarise what I learned out of this was that, the pandemic has interrupted the way that we live and the way that we think about our community and our family. So let's take the opportunity to think about how we go forward now. As we all know, women are 50% of the population, slightly more than 50% of the population. So as we said, if women do well, the economy does well. And then women and men and everybody does well. And that's what we need to look at. So I think the important question to ask is that as we move forward, do we have everyone at the table? Is everybody there? Not only women and men, but all the different groups that make our really rich society and our community, and that often have been at times missed out and left behind and hidden. And I think asking them, making sure that we're bringing them forward and having those really rich conversations, hopefully in person, is going to be a way forward for us. So thank you once again, and thank you to everybody who's watching and listening tonight. We really appreciate you coming along. I love these conversations because I come out of them often with more questions than answers. But I think we've got some really rich thinking to do, and I really appreciate all of you. So I want to finish there and say thank you and good night.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.